The old Victorian house on Blackthorn Road had secrets embedded in its walls, and nobody knew it until the Savanna cat arrived. Her name was Zephyr, a sleek, intelligent creature with amber eyes that seemed to read rooms like books. I'd adopted her 3 weeks ago from a shelter, drawn to her calm intensity and the peculiar way she studied spaces as if mapping invisible territories. That Tuesday morning everything changed when she began clawing obsessively at the wall behind my study desk, a behavior entirely unlike her measured, deliberate nature. Her focus was surgical, almost frantic. The plaster crumbled under her persistence, and I found myself kneeling beside her, confused and curious, my rational mind struggling to understand what her instinct already knew. What lay beyond that wall would force me to confront a truth I'd buried for years, and would test whether I had the courage to finally speak it aloud. Chapter 1. The scratching begins. Zephyr arrived on a grey afternoon in late September, and from the first moment she stepped into my study, she moved with the certainty of something remembering rather than discovering. The shelter volunteer had mentioned she was intense and preferred quiet homes, which suited me perfectly. At 42, I'd built a life of deliberate solitude. A freelance architect working from home, no family nearby, no real friends to speak of. The silence was both refuge and prison, though I'd never admitted which. The study was my sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a vintage oak desk, windows overlooking the overgrown garden. I'd chosen this house specifically for its bones. Victorian, 1887, solid brick and mystery. The realtor had mentioned previous owners, but provided little detail. That suited me, too. For the first 2 weeks, Zephyr claimed the armchair by the window, watching birds and occasionally me with equal indifference. I liked that about her. She didn't demand emotional labor. She simply existed, dignified and complete. But on that Tuesday morning, everything shifted. I was reviewing blueprints for a community center renovation when I heard the first scratch. Not urgent, not aggressive, deliberate. I glanced up. Zephyr stood on her hind legs against the wall to the left of my desk, the section behind which ran the house's original chimney, now sealed and dormant. She scratched again, her claws finding purchase in the old plaster. "Zephyr, no," I said absently, returning to my work. She didn't stop. If anything, her focus intensified. By noon, she'd gouged 3 distinct grooves into the wall. The plaster was old, brittle. It crumbled easily. I should have stopped her. But something in her persistence held me. Animals don't do this without reason. That's what people always say, and I'd always dismissed it as sentimentality. Now I wasn't so sure. I set down my pen and knelt beside her, running my fingers along the gouges. Behind the plaster, the brick was dark, stained somehow. I pressed my hand against it, and the wall felt different there, slightly hollow, acoustically distinct from the solid wall elsewhere. "What is it?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. Zephyr turned to look at me, and for the first time since her arrival, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't indifference. It was knowing. It was urgent. It was a question I didn't yet know how to answer. I fetched a hammer and chisel from the basement, my heart moving faster than the task warranted. The plaster came away in chunks, revealing old brick beneath. But there, at the edge where the brick met the chimney structure, was something that didn't belong. Metal, silver, catching the afternoon light. I stopped. My hands trembled slightly as I set down the tools. Chapter 2. Behind the brick. It took me 3 hours to carefully remove enough plaster and brick to see clearly what Zephyr's instinct had detected. My hands ached. Dust coated my face, my shirt, my throat. But with each layer removed, the object became more visible, more real, more impossible to ignore. It was a strongbox, small, rectangular, constructed from steel that had weathered the decades but remained intact. No rust, no corrosion, as if time itself had preserved it for this exact moment. I sat back on my heels, breathing hard. The afternoon light had shifted, now slanting through the study windows at a lower angle, casting long shadows. Zephyr lay nearby, watching. She'd stopped scratching once I'd begun the work, as if her job was complete. Her assignment was delivered. The rational part of my mind, the architect's mind, trained in logic and evidence, generated a dozen explanations. Previous owners, a hidden safe for valuables, a time capsule. But beneath that rational thinking was something older, something I recognized as fear. I didn't want to know what was inside. That sounds absurd, I know. Most people find a mysterious box and feel excitement, curiosity, the pull of discovery. But I felt dread. It was the same sensation I'd experienced when my mother had called 15 years ago, asking if we could finally talk about what happened. I'd hung up instead. I looked at Zephyr. "You're sure about this?" I asked. She blinked slowly, the cat's equivalent of a nod. I reached into the hollow and withdrew the strongbox. It was heavier than expected and warm somehow, as if the brick had been conducting heat from somewhere deeper. There was no lock visible, just a simple latch, tarnished but functional. My fingers hesitated on the latch for what felt like several minutes, though my watch suggested it was only seconds. Time does strange things when you're standing at the edge of a revelation. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth so carefully preserved it seemed almost ceremonial, were letters. Dozens of them, maybe more. And beneath the letters, a photograph in black and white, its edges soft with age. A young man stood with his arm around a boy of perhaps 14. Both were smiling. Both had the same distinctive curve to their jawline, the same dark hair. Both looked like me. I forgot to breathe. The study tilted slightly, and I gripped the desk edge to steady myself. The photograph was dated on the back, July 1952. Chapter 3. The First Letter. I didn't open the letters that day. Instead, I placed the strongbox on my desk, and Zephyr and I sat in the study until the light faded completely. I needed time to think, though my thoughts were fragmentary and loud, a chorus demanding attention but forming no coherent narrative. At 8 o'clock I made tea. At 9 I fed Zephyr. At 10 I finally picked up the first letter, the topmost one in the collection, its envelope addressed in careful slanted handwriting. To whoever finds this, not to whom it may concern, not a date, but to whoever finds this, as if the writer knew someone would eventually discover these letters, that the wall would eventually be breached, that 40 years later a woman would kneel beside a Savanna cat and pull destiny from behind old brick. The letter began. If you're reading this, then perhaps enough time has passed that the truth won't destroy the people I love. Or perhaps you're a stranger entirely, and that's better still. Either way, I owe someone a story I was too afraid to tell when breath still mattered. My hands shook as I read. The letter was signed with an initial I didn't recognize. The paper itself seemed fragile, important, dangerous. I set it down carefully and looked at Zephyr. If you're enjoying this journey so far, I said aloud, testing the words like someone learning a new language, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The absurdity of it, of speaking my life story into the void of an imaginary audience, broke something open in me. I laughed. A sound caught between wonder and something that might have been grief. Zephyr jumped onto my lap and I let her, holding her weight like an anchor, like a promise that I would read what came next. Chapter 4. The Man in the Photograph. The letters were ordered chronologically, beginning in 1952 and ending in 1978. The handwriting remained consistent, but evolved. Deeper pressure in the early years, lighter and more hesitant toward the end. They weren't letters in the traditional sense. They were fragments, memories, and confessions written across decades by someone who needed to record the truth but couldn't speak it aloud. By midnight, I'd read the first three. The man in the photograph was named David Chen. He was born in 1938 in San Francisco, the son of a Chinese immigrant and an Irish-American woman whose families had disowned her for the marriage. The boy he stood beside, the one who looked like him, the one I was beginning to understand was connected to me somehow, was his son. His name was Marcus. David's letters explained that Marcus's mother had been a woman named Eleanor, whom David had loved but could never publicly acknowledge. Eleanor came from a prominent family in Philadelphia, the same Philadelphia where my grandmother had been born, where she'd lived before she moved to California and started a new life, erasing her history with the efficiency of someone building a firewall against her own past. Marcus was my mother's half-brother, an uncle who'd never existed in any story she'd told me. I set down the fourth letter, my mind reeling. The house suddenly felt different, not haunted, but inhabited by a presence I'd never suspected. The walls held witnesses to a life parallel to mine, connected by invisible threads of blood and silence. Zephyr had fallen asleep on my lap, her weight steady and real. I envied her the peace of it. The fifth letter mentioned that Marcus had discovered his father was terminally ill, that Marcus had wanted to do something, to create something, to leave evidence that he'd existed, that his father had existed, that their connection had mattered despite the world's refusal to acknowledge it. But the next letter, the one dated 1968, was written by David himself, and the final line before his signature was, "Tell him I loved him. If no one else in this world would, at least let those words be true in the dark." I closed my eyes. I understood what Zephyr had known before I did. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And sometimes the most powerful act of love is simply ensuring that the truth survives. Chapter 5. The Bridge Between. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat with the letters, reading them in sequence, creating a narrative that explained absences, silences, and the peculiar grief that had defined my mother's later years, a grief she'd never named, never explained, only carried like a stone in her chest. David Chen had died in 1968. Marcus had scattered his ashes in the Pacific Ocean, and then Marcus himself had disappeared from the historical record. But before he did, he'd written letters of his own, letters to his father, letters to the person who might eventually find them, letters that functioned as both elegy and testimony. Marcus wrote about love, not romantic love exclusively, though there was that, a relationship with another man named Robert, a relationship that had to be conducted in shadows and coded language, that couldn't exist in daylight, but also love for his father, complicated and fierce, love for the idea of truth, love for the possibility that someday someone might find these words and understand that his life had been real, had been valuable, had been worth recording. The final letter Marcus wrote was addressed to me, not by name, he couldn't have known my name, but addressed to the person who understands. "By now you may know part of the story," he wrote. "You may understand what we lost, what we couldn't say, what the walls were forced to keep. But I hope you understand something else. We were here. We loved. We existed fully, completely, as ourselves, even if only in the dark. That counts for something. That has to count for something." I wept. I didn't know I could still do that. Weep, I mean. I'd spent so many years cultivating distance from my own grief that I'd forgotten it was possible. Zephyr woke and climbed higher on my chest, her head just below my chin. I felt her heartbeat steady and sure, and it steadied me. By dawn, I'd made a decision, but I didn't yet know how to execute it. I only knew that these letters, this evidence, couldn't return to the wall. They'd been hidden long enough. Chapter 6. The Weight of Witness. The next morning I called a lawyer, not my regular attorney who handled contracts and property disputes, but someone who specialized in family law and historical documentation. Her name was Dr. Sarah Okafor, and when I sat across from her desk and placed the strongbox between us, she didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked at me. "These letters," I began, "they were hidden in my house. I believe they belong to previous occupants. I believe they document a family history that was intentionally erased. I believe they're evidence." "Evidence of what?" Dr. Okafor asked. "Evidence that people existed," I said. "Evidence that they loved. Evidence that they deserved to be remembered." She opened the box carefully, read the first letter, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite pass. "These need to be preserved," she said finally. "Properly preserved. And you need to decide what you want to do with them. Are you going to publish them, archive them, contact the family?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if the family would want them known. I don't know if it would hurt people who are still alive, or if silence has already hurt them enough." Dr. Okafor nodded slowly. "Then here's what I recommend. We have these professionally preserved and authenticated. We create a legal document establishing their provenance and your ownership, and then we wait. Not forever, but long enough for you to understand what the right choice is." That afternoon, as I was leaving her office, I received a message. "If this story has you hooked, hit like. It helps us share more real stories of animal instinct and hope." For a moment, I didn't understand. Then I realized I'd been narrating my discovery to my empty study, to Zephyr, to the walls themselves. I'd been telling this story aloud as if someone were listening. Perhaps someone was. Chapter 7. The choice to speak. Over the following weeks, I did research. I contacted historical archives. I searched for records of David Chen, Marcus Chen, and Eleanor Hartwell, my grandmother's maiden name. I found documents, newspaper clippings, census records. I found evidence that my mother had changed her name from Chen Hartwell to simply Hartwell when she moved to California. I found a photograph in a San Francisco Chronicle archive from 1965 showing a young man and a middle-aged man standing together at a community center opening. The caption identified them only as local residents, but I knew. One of them was Marcus, one was David. I found my mother's birth certificate listing Chen as the family name. I found adoption paperwork for Marcus, processed in 1954. Which showed that he'd been legally renamed, erased, to protect the Hartwell family reputation. The more I discovered, the clearer the picture became. My grandmother had been pregnant when she married my grandfather. That child, her son, had been my mother's older brother. He'd been given up for adoption, placed with David Chen, and somehow the two had discovered each other later. My mother had always known. She'd carried that secret her entire life. I called my mother. I didn't ask permission to speak. I simply told her what I'd found, what I'd understood, and that I intended to ensure Marcus and David weren't erased again. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask." That conversation lasted 6 hours. By the end, she was crying, and I was holding my phone so tightly my hand ached. She told me stories about Marcus, about the time he'd taught her to ride a bicycle, about the last time she'd seen him, 1967, a goodbye in a train station, about the guilt she'd carried for never trying harder to maintain contact. "I was a coward," she said. "I was just a girl, and then I was a woman, and I was too afraid." "It's not too late," I told her. "We can do this now. We can tell the truth now." Chapter 8. The archive. I spent the next 3 months working with Dr. Okafor, archivists, and a team of researchers to properly document and preserve David and Marcus's letters. We created an oral history project, recording my mother speaking about her brother, about her father, about the life she'd hidden. We contacted historians specializing in LGBTQ+ history, Chinese American history, and the complex intersections of immigration, identity, and family. The process was painful and beautiful in equal measure. I created a digital archive with transcriptions, photographs, and contextual information. I contacted universities to offer the collection. I researched publication options, always asking myself, what would David have wanted? What would Marcus have wanted? The answer seemed clear. They would have wanted to be remembered truthfully. Zephyr remained constant through all of this, a small, intelligent presence anchoring me to the present moment, even as I worked to preserve the past. She still slept on my lap while I reviewed documents. She still watched the garden from her window. She was, in her own way, part of the story, the witness who'd pulled the truth from behind the wall. One afternoon, as I was preparing the archive for its first institutional placement, I realized something. Zephyr hadn't scratched the wall since that initial day. She'd done what she came to do. She'd opened the door. Now it was my responsibility to walk through it. Chapter 9. The Weight of Truth. The archive launched in November, a year after Zephyr arrived. It was initially housed at the San Francisco History Center, but copies were sent to universities and LGBTQ+ archives across the country. David Chen's face was printed in historical journals. Marcus's letters were quoted in academic papers about identity and erasure. My mother gave interviews about growing up with this secret. The story of two men loving each other in silence, of a boy trying to honor his father's memory, of a family's deliberate forgetting and eventual remembering. It resonated. People reached out, descendants of neighbors, friends, colleagues. A man who'd known Marcus in the 1960s and wanted to add his testimony. A woman who'd been Eleanor's nurse in her final years and had always wondered about the sadness behind the older woman's eyes. The truth, once released, created its own momentum. It couldn't be put back, but there were costs too. Some family members were angry. The revelation damaged relationships I didn't have. There were people who felt their privacy had been violated, their family's carefully constructed narrative disrupted. I can't say that was wrong. Privacy matters. Comfort matters. I had to live with the fact that my choice to speak had caused some people pain. One evening, as I sat in my study with Zephyr curled in her chair, not the armchair by the window, but my work chair, where she sometimes joined me now, I thought about why she'd scratched that wall. The rational explanation was probably simple. Maybe she'd heard mice behind there, or sensed a draft, or responded to some stimulus I couldn't perceive. Animals are driven by small, tangible things, a scent, a sound, a vibration, but I'd learned something over this year. The boundary between simple instinct and something deeper, something like knowing, something like love, is thinner than we admit. Zephyr had led me to the truth, not because she understood the historical significance or the emotional weight of what was hidden. She'd simply acted on what she sensed. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. The last letter I found, tucked into the back of the strongbox and addressed simply to her, was from Marcus to my mother. He'd written it in 1974, 4 years before he died, though of course I didn't know that until later. "You don't have to carry this alone," he'd written, "but I know you will, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. When you're ready, when you're finally ready, tell someone. Tell the truth. Don't let us disappear." She had, we had, and now David and Marcus existed in the world, not as shadows or secrets, but as real people who'd lived, loved, and mattered.